welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle a concept that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. Equality. But, we're not just going to skim the surface. We're going to really, dig deep
Yeah.
and figure out, what makes this idea so fascinating and so tricky, too.
Absolutely.
And to guide us on this journey, we've got excerpts from a really cool source.
Okay.
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on equality.
Perfect.
So get ready. We're gonna put those brain muscles to work.
I love that. I think, one of the things that's so interesting about the word equality is that it's used all the time like it's some kind of magic wand
Oh, totally.
to fix all of society's problems. But when you actually try and nail down what it means, you realize it's actually really complex.
Totally. It's like one of those things that, you think you understand it.
Yeah.
But then when someone asks you to explain it, you're like, wait a minute. So let's start with the basics. What is equality anyway?
Right, let's do it.
So imagine you got two apples. Okay. They're both red. They're both delicious.
Right.
But one of them has a little bruise.
Mm-hmm.
Are those apples equal?
Hmm.
Are they similar? Are they identical?
That's a good question.
It's a simple example, but it kind of gets you thinking, right?
Yeah, it does. And I think that's kind of the point that the Stanford Encyclopedia is making when they're defining equality.
Right.
It doesn't mean that things have to be totally identical in every single way.
Right.
It's more are they the same in one important aspect?
Okay, so in our apple analogy, they're equal in appleness.
Exactly.
But, maybe not in their visual perfection.
Right. One might look prettier than the other.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And that's also where philosophers get really, specific about the language they use.
Oh, yeah.
Always. Because we're talking about, justice and how we treat each other.
The words we use actually matter, a lot. And so the encyclopedia really highlights the difference between equality and identity.
Okay, yeah.
So identity means something is literally one and the same.
Okay.
Our apples, they're different apples.
Right.
But they can still be considered equal in certain ways.
Okay. So we've got this kind of baseline understanding of what we mean by equality. But when philosophers are debating this stuff, what are the the rules of the game? What are the big principles that they're working with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah.
According to the Stanford Encyclopedia, there are three major principles that kind of guide these debates.
Okay.
We've got formal equality, proportional equality, and moral equality.
Wow. Okay. Let's break those down one by one.
Yeah, let's do it.
Starting with formal equality. That sounds, pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it does, kind of on the surface, right? Basically, it means treating cases alike.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
But, as you can imagine, it can get pretty complicated pretty fast.
I can imagine. I mean, what makes a case alike? Where do you draw the line?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? It really all comes down to, what criteria you're using to judge that similarity.
Right.
And those criteria can be influenced by all kinds of things, like social norms, cultural values, even our own personal biases can creep in.
Oh, for sure.
So, for example, if we're talking about equal access to education, what makes two students alike in a relevant way?
Right.
Is it their socioeconomic background? Is it their academic potential, their age?
Yeah.
It gets tricky really fast.
So formal equality is not as simple as it sounds.
Not at all, no.
Okay, well, let's move on to principle number 2 then.
Okay.
Proportional equality. Now, this one brings Aristotle into the mix.
It does, yes. Aristotle was a big proponent of this idea.
Right.
He argued that treatment should be proportional to what someone deserves or what they've earned. It's all about finding the right balance.
But see, that's where things get really interesting, because that whole idea of what someone deserves, that could be used to justify inequality too.
Absolutely.
If you believe that people with certain skills or social status, they deserve more, well, you could see how that could go sideways.
Yeah, definitely. Proportional equality isn't inherently egalitarian.
Right.
It all comes down to how you define deserving.
Right.
And what criteria you're using to measure it, right? Is it based on effort, talent, social contribution?
Yeah.
There's just so much debate around that.
It really gets you thinking. You know what? Listeners, pop quiz time.
Okay.
Think about a recent situation, where you saw this idea of proportional equality in action. What were the criteria being used? Was it fair?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah. Head to our social media. Let us know what you think. But let's move on to the third and arguably the most influential of these principles, moral equality.
Okay, yeah. This is a big one. This is really the cornerstone of like modern egalitarianism.
Okay.
It's the idea that every single person, no matter their differences, they just have this inherent dignity and they deserve equal respect.
And that's not just some fluffy philosophical ideal.
No.
This has real world roots, like historical movements, events.
Right, you're thinking like the Enlightenment, the fight for human rights, dismantling systems like slavery and segregation.
Right.
These are all grounded in this fundamental belief in moral equality.
So even if people differ in their abilities, achievements, social standing, there's still this core worth that demands equal respect. I mean, that's powerful stuff.
It is.
But here's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Agreeing that everyone deserves respect, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But does that automatically mean that everyone gets the same things?
No.
Same opportunities, same outcomes?
Yeah.
I have a feeling that this is where things get even more complicated.
You're telling me that's where the real debate starts. Because there are so many different ways to interpret what equal treatment actually looks like in practice.
Right. Like how do you even begin to put that into action?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to get into. So the Stanford Encyclopedia, they actually call these different interpretations, they call them currencies of equality.
Currencies, okay.
It's like imagine you've got different tools in your toolbox.
Oh, yeah.
You pick the right tool depending on the job you're trying to do.
So we're not just dealing with apples anymore. We've got a whole hardware store of equality concepts to work with.
Exactly. And maybe the simplest one to start with is it's called simple equality in the encyclopedia.
Simple equality. Yeah.
The idea is everyone gets the same exact amount of everything.
Okay.
Sounds pretty fair on the surface, right?
I mean, yeah, in theory. But in reality, I feel like that's about as practical as trying to make everyone wear the same size shoes.
Right.
Like, what about people who have different needs?
Yeah.
What about people who contribute more? It doesn't seem very realistic.
No, it's not very realistic. Simple equality really ignores individual circumstances and needs.
Right.
And it could even discourage people from, working hard or being innovative.
Yeah, like why bother if everyone's getting the same reward no matter what, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so simple equality is probably off the table. What other tools are in this philosophical toolbox?
Well, there's libertarianism.
Libertarianism.
And that takes kind of a more hands-off approach.
Okay.
It's all about individual liberty, property rights, less concerned with redistributing wealth.
So basically you're on your own, sink or swim.
Yeah, kind of.
But what about people who are born with disadvantages?
Right.
People who never really even get a fair shot. Does libertarianism address those issues?
That's one of the big critiques of libertarianism.
Okay.
It can lead to pretty significant inequalities if you're not, acknowledging those systemic disadvantages and trying to level the playing field.
Right. Okay, so maybe libertarianism isn't perfect either.
It's got its pros and cons.
What about utilitarianism?
Utilitarianism.
The whole, greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty appealing at first.
I mean, on the surface, sure, it sounds great. But, when it comes to equality, utilitarianism, it's got its own issues.
Okay.
Remember, the core principle is maximizing overall happiness.
Right.
But what if the majority's happiness, comes at the expense of a minority group?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So you're saying, if most people wanted to see a certain group suffer, utilitarianism might be okay with that.
It does raise some concerns about, protecting individual rights.
Yeah.
Preventing the tyranny of the majority.
Right. You got to be really careful how you apply that principle.
Exactly. You have to consider the inherent dignity of every person.
Okay. So utilitarianism's got its limits, too. What about welfare equality?
Welfare equality.
This idea of everyone having the same level of well-being.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good in theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is well-being is subjective. It's really hard to measure.
Yeah.
And what makes one person happy might not do it for someone else.
Right.
And then there's also, the issue of people with expensive tastes.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Is it fair to give someone more resources just because they happen to prefer fancier things?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Like, are we
Mm.
trying to get everyone to the same subjective experience of happiness?
Right,
Or is there a more objective way to do this?
exactly.
Hmm. Speaking of objective, what about resource equality? That seems to be a really popular idea these days.
Yeah, resource equality is all about making sure everyone has access to the same initial resources.
Okay.
But then it leaves it up to them to decide how they're going to use those resources.
So it's like everyone lines up at the starting line with the same stuff.
Yeah, like a level playing field at the beginning of a race.
Exactly.
And then their own choices and efforts, those determine the outcome.
Oh, I like that analogy.
And two big names that are associated with this approach are John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin.
Oh, Rawls, didn't he come up with that veil of ignorance thing?
Yes, the veil of ignorance. That was his big idea.
Can you remind our listeners what that is?
So Rawls argues that if you were designing a just society,
Okay.
but you had no idea where you'd end up in that society.
Like you didn't know if you'd be rich or poor.
Right. You didn't know your wealth, your talents, your social status.
Okay.
You would naturally choose a system that protected even the least advantaged.
Makes sense.
And that's what he calls the difference principle.
So inequality is okay as long as it benefits the people at the very bottom.
Yeah, it's kind of like a built-in safety net.
Right. So no one falls too far behind.
Exactly. Dworkin takes a slightly different tack. He talks about this like hypothetical auction where everyone starts with equal bidding power.
Okay.
And they use it to acquire resources.
So it's like a free market, but with an actual level playing field at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I like that. But this whole conversation about resources, it raises another question for me.
Okay.
What about the people who, through no fault of their own, can't even compete on that level playing field?
Right.
Like folks who are born with disabilities, for example.
That's where luck egalitarianism comes in.
Luck egalitarianism.
It aims to kind of compensate for disadvantages that are outside of a person's control.
So like someone who's born with a disability might get extra support to help them overcome those challenges.
Yeah, exactly.
But how do you decide what counts as like bad luck
Right.
versus personal responsibility? That seems really, really tricky.
It is. It is. That's one of the ongoing debates within luck egalitarianism.
Figuring out where that line is.
Exactly where you draw that line.
You know what? I'm noticing a pattern here.
Yeah.
It seems like every approach we've talked about.
Yeah.
It's got strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
And there's always going to be those like gray areas, those tricky situations.
Mhm.
Is there any approach that tries to take a more like holistic view?
There is.
Okay.
The Stanford Encyclopedia talks about what's called the capabilities approach.
The capabilities approach.
It shifts the focus from just resources to what people can actually do with those resources.
Oh, okay.
So the goal is to ensure that everyone has the capability to live a fulfilling life, no matter their circumstances.
So it's not just about having a wheelchair. It's about being able to access buildings,
Yeah.
participate in the workforce.
Exactly.
Like really engage with society.
Yeah. It's about creating a world where everyone can thrive.
Not just survive. I love that.
It's about recognizing that true equality, it goes beyond material stuff.
Yeah.
It's about empowering individuals to reach their full potential.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. But it makes me wonder, like we've been talking about equality within a specific society.
Yeah.
But do these ideas apply to everyone in the world? What about future generations? Do we have a responsibility to ensure equality for people beyond our borders, beyond our lifetimes even?
Those are big questions, like really big.
Yeah.
And they kind of take us into some like, mind-bending philosophical territory.
Yeah, for sure.
The Stanford Encyclopedia, they touch on these issues when they talk about global justice and intergenerational justice.
Right, right.
It's like we're expanding that definition of equality beyond just our immediate circles.
Yeah.
Do we have obligations to people in other countries, to generations that haven't even been born yet?
The whole other layer, right? It makes you realize how interconnected everything is.
It really does, yeah.
But let's come back to the core concept for a minute.
Okay.
Because after all this discussion about different types of equality and principles and stuff, I think some listeners might be wondering, like, why should we even care about equality in the first place?
Yeah, that's a fair question.
Like, what's the big deal? Why does it matter?
Well, that why is another point of debate among philosophers.
Of course it is.
The Stanford Encyclopedia, they lay out three main schools of thought on this. We've got intrinsic egalitarianism, instrumental egalitarianism, and a constitutive egalitarianism.
Okay. Those are some big words.
I know, right?
But
Yeah.
let's break them down. Starting with intrinsic egalitarianism.
Okay.
What's the main idea there?
So intrinsic egalitarians, they believe that equality is just inherently valuable, like in and of itself.
Oh.
It's a good thing, period.
So it's not about the consequences, it's about the principle itself.
Exactly. They see inequality as just fundamentally wrong.
Okay. Interesting. What about instrumental egalitarianism? How did they see it?
Instrumental egalitarians, they see equality as more of a means to an end.
Okay.
They argue that it leads to other good things like greater social stability, economic growth, maybe even more individual freedom.
So it's good because it produces good outcomes.
Yeah, you could kind of think of it as like a utilitarian perspective on equality.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And finally, we've got constitutive egalitarianism.
Yeah, this one's interesting.
What's the core idea there?
So, for constitutive egalitarians, they basically believe that equality is justice.
Okay.
It's all about treating everyone with that equal respect and concern. It's built into the very fabric of a just society.
So for them, it's not just one value among many.
Right. It's the defining feature, like the foundation.
Wow. This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. We've covered so much ground, different types of equality, philosophical principles, ethical implications.
Yeah. It's amazing how one little word can spark so much discussion.
It really is. It really shows you the power of philosophy to challenge those assumptions and make us think deeper.
Absolutely.
So to our listeners out there, as you go about your day, we challenge you to kind of think about these different currencies of equality that we talked about.
Yeah. Think about the ones that resonate with you. Think about where you see them playing out in your own life.
Yeah.
And maybe even more importantly, where do you see inequality? Where is it still a problem? What kind of equality is missing in those situations? Keep those questions in mind.
That's a great point.
Yeah, as you navigate the world out there.
Well said. Until next time, everyone, keep thinking deeply and keep striving for a more just and equitable world.